Hi, it's me, Kaity.
And me, Adriane.
And you're listening to KindlED,
a podcast where we dig into the science behind building relationships and environments that help kids unlock their full potential and become empowered learners.
Together, we'll discover evidence-based tools and methods that will empower you to kindle the curiosity, motivation, and well-being of the young people in your life. Hello, welcome to the KindlED Podcast, everyone. Adriane and I are super excited to talk about attachment today. We're doing a deep dive on something called attachment, and you maybe don't know what that is, but that's okay. We're here as beginners to learn together, to understand the science of attachment today and be able to apply it to our lives. So, Adriane, what the heck are we talking about when we use the word attachment?
Well, I had heard of attachment parenting, which is different than what we're talking about with attachment theory. And so it was like, wear your baby, sleep with your baby, be with your baby all the time. So I had all the fancy wraps. I mean, my second child, I think I wore him every single day for the first at least 14 months. And well, it was out of necessity because I had a really hyperactive 2.5-year-old. And so I was aware of attachment parenting, and some of it I was like, oh, this is a little much. But then it wasn't that long ago, actually, probably a couple of years ago, I was reading Parenting from the Inside Out by Dr. Dan Siegel and Mary Hartzell. And it's a hard read, but it's a really, really good book. It's hard because of all the language that he uses. It's very heavy in brain science. And he goes pretty deep into attachment. And I remember as I'm going through all the different attachment styles, oh my gosh, this is why I struggle in relationships. This is what's happening. I remember like taking it to my husband and reading all the different attachment styles. And I was like, look, like anytime like we like have some challenges, this is what's happening. This is why we have 2 different attachment styles. So that was like my first experience with applying attachment theory to how I was wired. And then it took a little time before I discovered Gordon Neufeld's work in learning about how my kids attach to me and other adults in their lives. What about you?
Pretty similar. I was raising my kids with a very kind of behavioralist, consequences-based approach. I was reading a lot of books about just being super consistent and very structured and organized around how you respond to kids. But what I was missing in those books is like, when do I love them? Like when I didn't have like a lot of like, just like snuggly warmth growing up. Like I was taken care of. I've always felt safe kind of ish, depending on the definition of safe. But yeah, I really started reading these books. And the first one I read was Easy to Love, Difficult to Discipline by Becky Bailey. And that book that led me to Gordon Neufeld, which is he's just like a wealth of knowledge about this topic and is able to put it together in a way that just makes everything, it's just like a new set of glasses. Honestly, it's like, oh, suddenly everything makes sense when I'm looking at my child and when I'm looking at myself and whenever there's any sort of like tension or frustration, it's like, oh, this is yet another way that this child is asking me to show them that I love them, regardless of what's happening. And I just wanted to give my kids that. And that led to me doing a lot of personal work on me and relationships so that I was able to give them a better foundation for how to interact. I kind of grew up thinking and being told that any sort of emotion or feeling was like weakness and was bad, right? Like only analytical, we should only be moved by empirical evidence, which I love evidence and empiricism and all sorts of things like that. But still, I love data. But there's this like very warm human side to all of that that's kind of missing. And when we deny that in ourselves and we don't make space for it for our children, we get a lot of tension and we get a lot of fighting and we get power struggles and all these things. We get kids that don't want to do their homework and all of the things that I like spend a lot of time talking to moms about, like at the park, just like, oh, all of this really like there's like a center pole and all of the things we kind of not complain about, but like are concerned about, things that stress us out, they're kind of like symptoms of this one big thing in the middle that is hard to see. And attachment theory was like the new lens on life that helped me see things with more clarity.
That's interesting you say that, because early psychologists, I don't know if you knew this, they really thought affection would only spread diseases and lead to adult psychological problems. So that's what people were being told in the early 20th century. And I'm going to get to this later with some studies, but a psychologist was like, well, but what about the love? And that's what you said. You're like, okay, all the consequences, behaviorism, get a child to act a certain way, but what about the love piece? And that is really what attachment theory is all about. And it's pretty new to the field. I want to say the 70s is where they started to really dive into research, and maybe like late 60s. So it's still pretty young.
Science coming to this, knowledge and being able to like measure and describe the benefits of this is new, but it's actually just like kind of, we used to, for hundreds and thousands of years, parent with a lot more intuition. And so we were doing all of these things until scientists and psychologists in the early 20th century like told us to stop doing them for a little bit. And then we raised a few generations without this, and it became normal to not parent in this way, or to interact. I won't just say parenting, but just, it's really just like, how do you frame your role as an adult in relationship to young people? So it's a lot broader.
Yeah, so we're having to get back to those roots, and we're realizing, though, I mean, look at the mental health crisis. We talk about that. We talk about trauma and trauma in the classroom.
We really have lost our moorings, and this is just the whole attachment movement and science behind it, I think, is just a grounding of like getting back to what humans have always done, how we've cared for and included and loved each other, and making room for that interdependence, and not labeling that interdependence as negative or as like what the word you said, like spreading disease. Like we really like do kind of, we put independence on a pedestal, and we're like, oh, we got to cut the apron strings. We got to do all these things. We got to detach. We've got to make these kids independent, which we'll talk about more later. But that's a fine goal, but it kind of makes it so you're subconsciously telling everyone that it's not okay to rely on those around you, and it's not okay to seek connection and like emotional relationship, that's weakness, and that is not how humans are built. So obviously we're having a lot of mental health issues.
Yeah. And we're talking about like love and attachment, but also it's really our system's need for security and safety. So that internal safety, which we talk a lot about when we talk about the nervous system, and just our brains are always seeking out safety. And that's why a lot of times you see really big behaviors when a child is not feeling internally safe. So this is all interconnected. So attachment is also our brain's understanding of whether connection and intimacy are safe and dependable, or if they're dangerous and or unpredictable. It's also understanding if our emotions are manageable and our bodies are to be trusted, or if emotions are dangerous and our bodies cannot survive intense stress, which you kind of talked about a little bit, how emotions were not a good thing, but emotions are just help us figure out what's happening. What's the word I'm looking for?
Information about the external world.
Information.
Yeah. And information can't be negative. It's just information.
Right. It's just information. And then our inner world makes sense, and we are worthy of being known, seen, heard, and understood. And this is connected to developmental needs that we have, that we all are born with. And, or if we don't get this attachment and feel, like we're seen and heard and understood, then we start to feel like we don't deserve it. And then this is kind of connected with acceptance as well. And we don't feel like we're accepted, which can lead to lots of mental health challenges.
Yeah. Sure. Can I go into that a little bit deeper?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So if you think about a little baby and you think like, what is the first thing that baby needs? Like, obviously they need to breathe first, right? And sometimes they can do that on their own. And sometimes they even need help to do that first thing, right? But from there on out, like they get all of their needs met through relationships. So that's why it's super hard coded into the brain to seek relationship. That relationship from the first moments of birth is literally equivalent to survival, right? So that's why all of this need for safety and security, why we're looking to relationships to get those safety cues to our brains, because our brains know that if we have these relationships, we will be safe, we will be protected, we will be fed, which are all of the things that we need to survive, right? And so that is just kind of helpful framing for when you're thinking like, well, I just don't want to, like, I'm just not an emotional person, or like, I'm just not very loving, or I'm not very warm. We have these stories that we kind of tell ourselves about how we are, who we are as adults. But when we realize like, oh my gosh, no, this is like literally the same thing as saying like, I just don't want to feed my kid. Like, I just don't want to put clothes on them or keep them warm. It's like, it is a survival need for them to be attached in a really strong, completely accepting, supportive relationship. And it can actually, like, there's oodles and oodles of research that show that a lack of attachment or relationship does the same thing to the brain as trauma or abuse or like not having enough food to eat, any of those kinds of really intense traumas. This is like on that same level. So before we got too much further, I just wanted to like really stress that.
Yeah, what you're describing here is secure attachment and insecure attachment. So secure attachment is what you're saying is when we're just feel fully connected and being fed and cared for. And so it's more than just the physical needs, but it's the physiological, emotional, psychological needs are met and the brain feels safe, because that's when a baby is born, they are wired to find connection with their caregiver. Dr. Dan Siegel and Tina Payne Bryson have an amazing book called The Power of Showing Up. And in there, they really break down the 4 S's of secure attachment, which is safe, seen, soothed, and secure. So that's secure attachment. I think we kind of covered that a lot. It's whenever a child feels safe.
To put that up against like standard parenting advice, it's like you have to ignore the things that they're doing because they're just seeking attention, right? So like that's not going to help a child feel seen, right? If we're thinking like, oh, I'm just going to ignore this behavior, or I'm going to ignore whatever it is because I want it to go away. Or same thing, like, let's just let our babies cry. And I know that there's like lots of feelings around letting babies cry or not letting babies cry, but I have let my babies cry lots. So, but being soothed.
We did too, at least with our first. By the third, we didn't. But that poor first child.
It's just that like we want, I'm just saying that like a lot of the parenting advice that you get is really at odds with what the child's psychological needs are. And we're painting those psychological needs as wrong, when like that's actually how the brain is wired. It's like saying, oh, you shouldn't be hungry. It's like, no, I'm growing, I should be hungry, right? So
what you just said, attention-seeking behaviors, and I forget who said this, but what I always think of is it's connection-seeking behaviors. So what ends up happening is if the child's not getting these internal psychological needs met, then what happens is the system becomes insecurely attached. And this really affects all relationships and lives. Mary Ainsworth is the first one that did research on this, and she came up with 3 total attachment styles, but then later there was a 4th one added. So the one is secure, and then second we have ambivalent, anxious attachment. So it's basically when you can't always depend on the adult. So the adult is sometimes there and sometimes not. So it's like I'm crying because I'm hungry. Sometimes the bottle's there, or I'm being fed in some way, or sometimes it's not. So the attachment system is kind of confused with anxious attachment. And then we have avoidant dismissive attachment, where basically they're not really getting the connection that they need, but they probably are getting their basic needs met. So that's me. I have an avoidant attachment from childhood because my basic needs were met. Like I was fed and I had a roof over my head and I was clothed, but then there wasn't really any emotional connection because my parents were working all the time, or they, just were busy, or they just didn't have the means to be able to give that connection to me. And then we have the disorganized insecure attachment, which this is usually when there's abuse. And so they are afraid of that caregiver. And so that can lead to lots, and all these insecure attachment can lead to lots of, behaviors that make sense whenever you look at it from an attachment lens. So without overwhelming with like all the different types and all the different things, I just want to make sure we understand that there's secure and insecure, and there's lots of different reasons why we can have insecure, and they lead to lots of different kind of behaviors. So today, what we're really going to cover is helping children develop a secure attachment. And you don't even have to be that child's parent. You can be that child's caregiver, teacher, coach. If you're in relationship with a child, you can develop a secure attachment with them. Especially there's so many children that go to school and they don't have a secure attachment at home. So like with me, I was able to securely attach to friends' parents. I had amazing attachments with a few of my best friends' parents. I think I talked about it in like episode 1 or 2. And also with teachers, because I was at school way longer than I was at home. And so this is really important to understand attachment on this lens of not just because you're a parent or a caregiver, but if you're an adult in a child's life. And then on a different episode, we're going to dive a little deeper on the adult's attachment style and how to come into a secure attachment with ourselves.
Okay, so there's this research study that has 90,000 kids in it. So like a huge national study. And they found that the one predictive factor of whether or not a kid was going to involve themselves in any sort of risky behavior as a teenager, as well as like perform well academically or have any sort of mental health issues, the one thing that had the greatest impact on all of those outcomes was the presence of one secure attachment in their life. Did not have to be a parent, did not have to be just one person that is a consistent presence that says, I've got you. Like, I'm with you, right? That's all the brain needs. And so with this episode, and also just KindlED in general, like we want to be grownups who know how to be that person, right? If you like, just think of the power, of the life-changing trajectory power that you have as one adult who, I mean, you probably know dozens and hundreds of kids, right? If we can all just learn how to be really effective, trusted grownups, like that is a lot of mental health and risky behavior and academic struggle that we are curtailing, right? Just by being available and knowing how to satiate the brain's need for attachment. So that's kind of the big picture.
I have all the feels, all the goosebumps on that one, because this is really powerful stuff. This matched with nervous system and helping our kids develop a strong nervous system that can move up and down that ladder and not be so rigid is huge. This is how we change the world, Kaity. This is how we change the world.
And it can happen so quickly too. It's not complicated. You have to like have some intention around it, and you have to know a little bit about what you're doing, but most of it is intuition. I just love this work, and it's just like such a bright spot of hope. There's so many things that go on in the world where you feel like, I just don't have any control over this. I'm just one little person, but it's like, oh my gosh, I'm one person. That's the perfect number of people to be to affect this great change in the world.
I always say that with anytime I coach parents, I'm like, think about this. Like, think that you're learning this now, but your children are going to grow up in this way and have this beautiful, secure attachment. And think about all the people they're going to impact and who they're going to be in relationship with. Like, you're changing so much just through learning this stuff and doing the work yourself. So I agree with you.
Okay, so as we jump in here a little deeper, it's really important to understand that there's a contrast between kind of behaviorism, thinking if I give my kids consequences, or as a teacher, if I just set up the right incentive system, that I'm going to get the behavior that I want, which is usually like stillness, quietness, obedience, things like that. And what we're talking about, where we're building meaningful, deep, lasting relationships with kids and helping them actually mature into individuals who can then manage themselves. So like the outcome might still look the same, might not. The effect of behavioralism is like, yeah, it definitely works, right? The kids are going to sit in their seats quietly if you're saying that they can't go to recess next. Like you're going to see that affect their behavior and you're going to think, man, this works. But what you're not seeing is the cost.
Well, not for all kids, but for most kids, it works. You're going to have a few of those that it does not work.
So when you're seeing these results, what you're not seeing is the cost, where they're really not actually maturing. It's almost like a fake grown-up. It's like an act that they're able to put on to acquire or avoid the thing that like the carrot or the stick that you're using. But what we really want is a prefrontal cortex that can inhibit behavior, that I can actually choose. Like, oh, I would never want to inconvenience this teacher who is going out of their way to serve me, right? So I'm going to keep my voice off and keep my body still. Like, and they're able to do that. They want to, and they're able to, because their brains are actually developed. And this is, like, alert here. I'm going to say something that's going to make you feel uncomfortable. The driver to this maturation is unfortunately big feelings. And as a part of that, like, behavior control that we want to see from kids, we want to see that our kids are able to control themselves. We want to see that they're grateful, that they are obedient, that they're all of these things. And I'm not saying anything that's wrong with that. I'm not saying that those are bad outcomes at all. I'm saying that the path that most of us are taking to get those outcomes, it's almost like a shortcut that is like, it gets you kind of the shell of those things. But there's a different way to get those results. It takes longer, and it's louder, and there's more movement involved, and there's a lot more feelings, right?
And there's a lot more crying.
I want to be super upfront about that. But it is a very real solution. And so as we come through our big feelings and we were supported and connected with through those big feelings, our brain learns like, oh, I can have a big feeling and then I can come through that big feeling. But if it's always like, stop the feeling, be quiet, be still, go to your room, be ashamed of feeling that, then it never really comes out into the forefront of the mind to be processed. And we lose a lot of the energy. It's almost like the gas to the prefrontal cortex development.
And then you have, the stress, the brainstem then just lives in this chronic state of stress, which inhibits development as well. And as you're talking about that, I keep thinking of neurons that wired together, and we're not allowing these neural pathways and connections to develop, to build from that limbic system, the big emotions, up to the prefrontal cortex that has what you're talking about, this ability to put the brakes on, to be aware and assess what's happening. And one time I heard an illustration of neural pathways being created. It's kind of like a forest, and you have all these trees and there's no path, or say like big tall grass and there's no path. And so you allow a child to do something once, like have these big feelings, feel through them, and that grass gets pat down a little bit. And then you let them do it again and then again. And then you're going to have a really awesome path, and they're going to be able to navigate that in such a better way than if that grass is big and we keep stopping it. There's not going to ever be a path, and it's like a lot more chaotic in the brain.
Sure. So I've actually been applying this anytime I've found myself in the middle of like a 4-year-old tantrum lately, where I just think to myself like, oh, God.
Yourself? No. You are having a 4-year-old tantrum, or you have a 4-year-old with a tantrum?
4-year-old tantrum? My 4-year-old name?
Gotcha.
So instead of just thinking like, man, I want this sound to stop, or like, I want her to just go have her feelings away from me, I think to myself how if I can stay connected in that moment and be empathetic and show her that like, our relationship is bigger and stronger than whatever really scary, overwhelming feeling she's probably having that's new to her and she doesn't have words for it and she doesn't really understand it. If I can stay connected in that moment, we've just harnessed all of that noise. It's almost like in Monsters, Inc., where they use the screams of the children for energy, you know? Just like, I'm not saying we should make our kids scream. That sounds so bad. But I'm saying like the feeling, which can involve loud sounds of crying, it's like that energy can be carried into development. And so it's like, it's not wasted. If we dismiss it and don't make space for it, that's when it's like, oh, what a wasted opportunity that was. We had a thing in life that didn't work. And what more is growing up than learning how to deal with futility?
And whenever you have this strong attachment, the child is going to have these bigger emotions with you because they feel safe enough to do that. So I have to remind myself that too, because even just this weekend, my 6-year-old, one moment I can handle the one moment. But when it's going on nonstop all day long, I'm like, okay, I sat on the floor, we played a game. We did a Tinker Crate together. We sat for 45 minutes and I made a claw with you. Why are you still screaming? Like, you're not supposed to. But then I get caught in that, trap of, wait, I'm connecting. He shouldn't have these big feelings. But no, it's kind of the opposite. It's like, I have to remind myself his brain is growing and that's okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's almost like, I don't know if this is helpful or not, but like after you work out really hard and your muscles are sore for a few days, it's almost like you can learn to see your kids' behavior as like the soreness from development, right? I don't even know if that has like a neurological underpinning. It's just a helpful analogy to make it easier to welcome, to like create space for those feelings and to meet those feelings with empathy and connection instead of like, your behavior is unacceptable. It's not okay that you're upset. You're overreacting. Please go have your feelings elsewhere. And then like, don't subject us to your feelings is essentially what we're telling kids a lot of the time. Not that we don't want them to learn how to control and regulate their emotions, but the false thing that's happening here is that we think that sending them away or telling them or shaming them around these things is the path to emotional maturation and emotional regulation, where like the exact opposite is true.
Right. And instead, it's the path to insecure attachment.
Some of our listeners are probably thinking like, well, that's how I was raised and I'm fine. Like, I would question whether or not you're fine. Like, if you think, I know that like sounds so terrible, but like, I thought I was fine for decades. And I'm like, oh, I like discovered this whole world of like feeling like I was just garbage because I was having feelings and feelings were a weakness and something to be embarrassed about. And like humans connect through struggle. And if you never feel safe sharing a struggle with someone, you're never going to have a meaningful relationship because that's where you go when you have struggle. And so we're just building isolation like bubbles for ourselves and for our children and for society. The other thing is that as a parent or as an adult, it is so important that we are the primary attachment and not so much the child's peers, because the peer has no power to raise that child up, right? It's almost as if like if you had a friend who knew exactly all the same words as you and you only ever talked to them, you would never learn any new words, right? You have to talk to people who know more than you, that have more life experience than you, that have a greater maturation in their brain than you, and that are actually responsible for you, right? Because part of that attachment is getting your needs met. And if you're going to another 15-year-old for your needs, like they're not going to be able to facilitate that. It's going to cause a lot of dysregulated attachment. And we just kind of have this perception that that's normal. It's normal for kids to totally detach from their families and parents and teachers, people that are responsible for them and actually have the capacity to love them unconditionally and just let them be with their peers all day. But that I would encourage us all to like not give up on that. That's not normal. It's normal for the past few decades, but it is not in the course of like humanity is very abnormal. So we all feel like, oh yeah, this is just normal. Teenagers are like this. Teenagers hate their parents, but it's like, no, actually, if they're getting their emotional and psychological needs met from us, that is actually where they'll go when they have struggles. But when you see them just going to their friends for struggles, that means that you, unfortunately, and I'm really talking to myself, like, because I need to work on this so much, but we fail so much because we have this perception that emotions are inconvenient and loud and scary and not okay, and you should just control yourself, that we don't make space for them. And then when the child has a struggle, they go to their friends who create that safe space for them instead of us. And so if you want to maintain influence with a child as they go through 15, 16, 17, 20, 25, 30, like it's more important that you were that safe space rather than you were the person withholding recess, or you were the person like making sure they were quiet, right? So there's this trade-off, and it's just, life is so chaotic and all of this is so normalized in society, it's almost impossible to see. And so hopefully we're just like kind of pulling back the curtain a little bit on what's really going on in the hearts and minds of these kids, because it's so important.
It's still really good for kids to have friends. That's not what Katie's not saying. Your kids cannot have friends. That's not what she's saying.
But not their primary, they shouldn't be their primary attachment, right? And it's hard to tell. I mean, attachment is not a super concrete, like on-off switch, right? So obviously that's going to be varied and widespread, and that's good and that's healthy. But it's when peer attachments have completely replaced the adult attachment. So now the adults in the lives of these kids, they have no power or influence to actually administer the care and nurturing and to meet the child's need, because you only accept care from those who you are attached to.
Right. And you have an underdeveloped brain trying to influence another underdeveloped brain. So it's just, and that's why it's really important we do this work, especially help our kids develop. We keep talking about maturation, but develop into fully developed brains. There's lots of things that can hinder that in development. So because that's the goal. If we can get to a fully healthy, fully developed brain by the time we're 27, 28, 30, whatever the number is now, I feel like it keeps getting older, then we can help our kids mature in a very healthy way, which is what.
And just a quick note that like, it's never too late. Like if you just listen to me for the last 45 seconds, you're probably like in some sort of shame cycle. So I'm really sorry about that, but I think it needs to be said.
You're not fine. Katie told you you're not fine. No, I'm kidding. And the whole, like, I turned out fine thing, what I struggle with it is like, but you're not your child. Your child's totally different than you as well. But it's like, let's look and go, are we able to fully have this extremely amazing quality of life that we can have when all of these needs are met? Or there's some things where, like you said, you're not being vulnerable, or you can't handle emotions or manage stress or whatever it may be. So, I mean, we're always trying to, once we know better, we do better.
I would just also add, like, is fine the goal? Is fine really the goal, right? Don't we want to go for like true maturation and development and like the full capacity of what it is to be and to live a human life and to do that with purpose and meaning? We want that for ourselves and for our kids. So this is the path.
Okay, so we're understanding what it takes for brain maturation and for secure attachment, and why is it so important? And I feel like my Pittsburgh just came out. Why it's so important? my Pittsburghese just came out. Why it's so important is because so much of like what we've been told and what we think around, kids' behavior is that we have to stop it. Emotions aren't okay, and all these things, and we're realizing that it's causing just a lot of trauma in the brain. And so I would love to know some more research around attachment and how they got to full circle back to, we do need to have strong connection and attachment. Just being, in strong relationship with a child is not going to cause you just to be diseased or to get sick. So how did we get here?
That's a great question. So one of my favorite studies, this started in 1975. It's called the Minnesota study for short. If you want to look it up, it's already in the show notes. They started studying these kids before they were born and have tracked them throughout their entire life. And the main lens that they've been looking at is attachment. And so definitely click on that. It's called the Minnesota Study of Risk and Adaptation from Birth to Adulthood. Yeah. So I guess, 1975. So that'd be like almost 50 years. That's so long. It's so cool. So essentially they took all of these kids and they looked at their early childhood development, like how their interactions were with their parents or primary caregivers, whoever they were. So they kind of like grouped these kids into secure attachment, insecure attachment. Those were kind of the buckets. And they let that happen naturally. They didn't intervene at all. They just observed and classified those kids. Some of their key findings early. So they said that once the kids started showing up, like in preschool and kindergarten, the kids that had a secure attachment were more likely to be rated as independent leaders, better in their academics. They were less like needy in the classroom. They were better behaved. All of these indicators that their teachers were kind of observing when they were like 4. And so that's totally counter to what you would think, right? You would think that if you were really stern and strict and like consistent and consequency, like all of that would lead to better behavior in school, but it's actually the opposite. So it's just like all of these outcomes that we want for our kids, we just have this false idea about the path to those outcomes. I'm not saying those outcomes are wrong. They're wonderful, but attachment seems to be a stronger, at least according to this research, like a stronger path to get those outcomes. They could also, like they studied them throughout high school. They retrospectively, they were able to predict who was going to graduate high school. Oh, I should say these are all low-income kids. And so they were able to predict with 77% accuracy which of these kids were going to graduate high school just based on their secure attachment or insecure attachment when they were little. That's astonishing. 77% accuracy is pretty good. What about you? What are some of your favorite research articles around this?
Well, the most famous and kind of what started this whole attachment theory movement, if you want to call it that, is Mary Ainsworth. And her study is called Strange Situation. Okay, so Strange Situation is basically, they took these steps. And if you Google it, I mean, it's very meticulous on how they measured all of these things. And so the parent and child are left alone in a room. The child explores the room with parental supervision. Then a stranger enters the room, talks to the parent, approaches the child. Then the parent quietly leaves the room. Then the parent returns and comforts the child. So then they were able to look at how the child acted and behaved to figure out. Then Mary Ainsworth was like, oh, we have secure attachment going on here. We have insecure attachment. And these are the different categories of insecure attachment based on how that child behaved. So yeah, so basically if the parent like leaves and the child is like crying and wants the parent, but then the just okay is, trusting of the adult, and then the parent comes in and the child comes up to the parent immediately, that's, secure attachment. And then with anxious attachment, they really scream and they're really intense whenever the parent leaves. And whenever they come back, they don't want the parent as much. And then avoidant is they could care less. If the parent leaves, parent comes back, they don't even really acknowledge the parent either way. And then I'm wondering, because Mary Ainsworth, she didn't have the disorganized, so I'm sure the behaviors were probably even more so dismissive and was fearful, like probably had this fear component to it. And then another study that I thought was really fascinating is Harlow, and he, again, was the psychologist that I mentioned at the beginning that was like, okay, we're looking at all these behaviors and things based on a behaviorism and what we're giving to the child and the results of the child. And it has to be empirical evidence and measured. And he's like, what about love? And that's a little harder to measure. And so he studied Reese, the monkeys. and he took newborn, and this is a controversial study, but this was back, I think, like in the 60s, 70s. And he took these newborn monkeys and put them in a cage with a wired mama monkey and a felt covered.
It's not a real monkey. It's just like chicken wire form of monkey versus chicken wire with fur on it.
With fur. But the chicken wire with no fur was feeding the infant. And whereas the chicken wire with fur wasn't doing anything, but they noticed that the newborns really spent a lot more time with the one covered in fur and cuddling it and being with it, even though it wasn't giving it food. And because that was the early thought process in the, again, not how we've lived for thousands of years, but in the, early 20th century, is that a parent's role is just to feed the child and to provide for those basic needs. And so he discovered that just a wired monkey covered in felt, the baby monkey preferred that for connection and love, which is pretty incredible.
That's cool. Can I do another animal study?
Sure. Oh, is this your favorite one?
It's so funny. So technically this study is called Environmental Programming of Stress Responses through DNA Methylation, Life at the Interface Between a Dynamic Environment and a Fixed Genome. But I like to call it the Licky Rat Mom study because they're literally measuring the like nurturance of mother rats to their rat pups through how much they get licked. And so I'll kind of back up and give you some context for the study. They're in this big rat lab, right? And they just noticed that some of the rats were doing a lot better in all of like the maze studies, and they were looking at their heart health, how anxious they were and things like that. So they started looking at how the mothers were treating them like right after they were born. And they discovered that some mothers had a tendency to like lick their rat pups a lot. Like they would take the little rat babies out and then put them back, and that would cause the mom to be like, where's my baby? And like come and like nurture the baby by licking it because she's a licky rat mom. And then other moms were just like, they did it a little bit, but they just like weren't super concerned. They're not that into it. And then they realized that all of the rats that came from the licky rat moms, they ended up being way more intelligent, like they could solve a maze faster. They were less anxious in new situations. Like they put, mice don't like open fields, like they like to stay along the sides of things. So just an open field with food in the middle to see how long that the rat would go to get the food, like take a risk essentially. They looked at their aggression, that like these rats that came from the licky rat moms, they were less aggressive. They had better heart health, all of this stuff. And so they're like, oh my gosh, there must be some tie. Maybe there's a tie. They wanted to understand the tie between the nurturance and all of these good outcomes. And so they did a trick on the rat moms. So this is why you could never do this in a human study. They did end up, anyways, I'll go into this later, but you couldn't technically do this to humans. Be very illegal. All the rats had their rat litters, and they noticed which moms were licky and which ones were not licky. And then they took the babies from the not licky rat moms and gave them to the licky rat moms to prove that it was not a genetic factor, right? And so the babies that came from the non-licky rat moms were nurtured by the licky rat moms, and they got the same results. So they were able to say, this is not a genetic factor. This is the direct result of this behavior. There's another study that is related to this, but not by the same people. And I'll have to look up who did it. But they showed that the reason that this happens essentially is if you take rats away from their parents very early, their stress response system is programmed to like not come on. But then if you take them away, it will kick on within like 4 hours, which means like they'll respond with like an adrenaline stress response. But if they're with the parent, they won't. But like that part of the brain is deactivated because they know like, oh, if something's happening, like licky rat mom to the rescue, like mom's gonna fight the cats, like whatever is gonna get a rat, the mom's got that. So this stress response remains inactive and actually tracks the brain for development instead of survival. And so that they've literally shown this now. They didn't switch any babies out, but they have actually found that this is true of humans as well. And they've done this really cool study in foster care. So they take kids that they've had very traumatic early childhoods, and they've given these foster parents or adoptive parents training about how to develop secure attachments with these kids. And they test their stress response system by judging the cortisol that's present in their saliva. Yeah, so it doesn't even take very long. It's like a matter of months after applying these new parenting techniques and like intentionally trying to cultivate an attachment, that the cortisol levels of the foster kids that had been through a lot of trauma were the same as their securely attached non-adopted peers. So they're able to like physiologically change the body's stress response through how they were interacting with their primary caregivers.
It is so powerful because I remember also, I don't know if it was a study or just information that they put out, but it was the Gottman
Mhm.
Institute. They're the relationship experts, but they also have information and a lot of resources for parenting. And because that's also a relationship, and they have something called like emotion coaching and how to become your child's emotion coach. And it's all connected to attachment. And they talked about how they can measure like a child's cortisol levels and can tell like how much fighting is in the home, how what's like happening in the home just based on those cortisol levels. So and that's something that they can't control. They don't know how to even communicate that. But physiologically, like what's happening beneath all the surface, we have to realize how impactful the environment is. Hopefully, you are convinced that attachment is very important and that it is the actual path to achieving the outcomes that we all want for our kids. And how we kind of just, veered off the path a little bit with information and listening to psychologists and when the early research was happening and how we're kind of circling back. And so Gordon Neufeld, which again is the, attachment researcher, has like spent I don't know how many years and years on attachment. He talks about the stages of attachment. And so if you're wondering, okay, because we talked about how you can't measure love, but this is really profound because you can kind of see your kids' behavior and then kind of go, okay, they're in this stage or they're in this stage of attachment.
Just know that you'll get stuck at these stages. It doesn't mean just because you're a certain age that you're going to be at this or that you should be. It's only as if your needs were met. This is like the best case scenario.
Correct. The first stage is proximity, and that's about 0 to 12 months. Like they're needing to be close to you. And then the second stage then is usually between the ages of 1 and 2, and that's sameness. So that's whenever you're going to see a 1 to 2 year old wearing mommy's heels or wanting to put makeup on her face and, doing a lot of similar behaviors. And then we have the next third stage, which is belonging or loyalty. So very loyal to you. So that's between the ages of 2 and 3. And then the fourth stage is significance and cherished. So what does that look like, Kaity?
When you're seeking significance, you want to know that like your primary caregiver, just like you're so important to them, right? Like you just want to know that they love you, that you're cherished by them. Like when you make eye contact with them, their eyes light up to say like, hi, like I see you. Like I am the person in the world that is the most excited to see you.
Yes. Facial expressions is so huge. There's so many mirror neurons and things that are really good. I don't remember the actual neuroscience of it, but our facial expressions have so many different things that really help our kids feel safe in a physiological level. And then we have stage 5, which is love and accepted without condition. That's between the 4 and 5 years old. And then 6 and forever, we have being known and confiding. That means that they're coming to you whenever they have a challenge or, they're not hiding things from you. Because that's what a lot of times with consequences and punishments. And what ends up happening is the child will do something when you're not around and then they hide it from you. Or, so they might act one way around you or like one way in the classroom whenever you're teaching them. But then outside, like out on the playground, they do lots of, behaviors that they wouldn't do in the classroom.
And this is exactly what we were talking about before. It's a false maturity that you're seeing with the behavior that's induced through behaviorism. Like they can handle that, but like this is their true level of maturation here, and it's done through relationship. And I just wanted to like go through what these look like a little bit more, because I just think it's good to like be able to see, like, let's help people like paint this lens. So like proximity like is going to be like that when you leave, it's a big problem. And the way that we satiate that need is to generously meet it, right? We don't want to force our kids into too much separation, because then they're not even going to hit this first milestone. We want to be together. We want to be we want to be held. We want to meet those needs, and we don't want to see those needs as our enemy or something that they need to grow out of. It's completely developmentally appropriate, and we meet their need, and that spurs the next stage. It's like stairs. Like when we're like, okay, this stair is stable. Like I'm pretty sure that my mom or dad or teacher is like going to be here for me. Like that is stable. Now I can move on to sameness. And so the way that we can help that foster that development is to point their face or point their attachment eyes into the sameness, where it's like, oh, like we can't always be with our kids, right? Like we do have to leave them sometimes. And so when we do that, in order to help them, we point them to sameness. So it's saying like things like, oh, like it can be very simple things or it can be very profound things. So immediately, as soon as I meet a child, I always like look for something we have in common. It's like, oh my gosh, what's your favorite color is pink? My favorite color is pink too. You like macaroni and cheese? I love macaroni and cheese. Like we just love these things together. We're like on team macaroni and cheese. Right. And so if you can associate some sort of like sameness around this, and you'll see this when kids are in something that's called attachment void or attachment alarm, where like they don't have this need met, what they will look for something like this. So if we put a bunch of kids together and they're all in attachment void, they will stay close together and they will look for people that are the same. So it's like, ooh, kid who likes trucks, you're my best friend. I'm totally fine if you're behind me because like my attachment brain is looking for sameness. Like you like blue, I like blue. We're on team blue. Like, and so you see this in cliques.
You see this in adults and in business training. They talk about always trying to find something that's same. Like whenever you're in a sales relationship, like that's huge.
So this is why, and you'll see this in teens that don't have strong attachment to their primary caregivers, like an adult. They want to be the same. They want to wear the same clothes. It is terrifying for them to be different. And then belonging or loyalty, you see the same thing where it's like, it's our family, like our family is so important. Oh yeah, we're all in the same family, or like we are part of the same church community, or we're on this soccer team, or like we belong to this thing. It's kind of similar to sameness, but there's more of like you're my son, or like you're my mom. Like there's more of like an ownership involved in that, where it's like, I'm so happy that I'm your mom.
Yeah, or my mommy, like toddlers a lot, like, my daddy, my mommy. Yes.
You'll see this in underdeveloped teens as well, when they become hyper focused on like, that's my best friend. Or like, that's my boyfriend. Like they become and you see this, like one of the main points that Dr. Neufeld says is that this is not an inevitable course of action. We only get to significance, love, and being known, these like later stages, with very few people in our adult life. And some adults don't have them with anyone, right? And so we're seeking proximity. We're seeking sameness. We're then seeking belonging. We'll go through the same thing, the same process. But just because someone's body grows up doesn't mean they've done this process, doesn't mean they've walked this developmental path in their brain. And that's why we see a lot of adults acting the way that they do. We have the same problems. Like sometimes like when you're interacting with certain people, it's just like, I feel like I'm in high school, right? Like this feels like high school still, because we haven't really grown up. We haven't matured. We've gotten older, we've gotten bigger, but we haven't matured.
Right. And it takes a lot of inner work, and to realize that only once you become an adult, like you have to do that. You can't constantly seek that from, like your caregivers. Like you now are fully grown, and there are ways to come into secure attachment, like which I mentioned, we're going to talk about in a whole different episode.
So the main take home for all of these stages is just you can know where your kids are by looking at what their behavior is. And the way to move them forward is to generously satiate that need and then point them into the next stage.
Okay. So now we're going to move on into question time really quick. So Kaity, do we have a question?
Yes, we do. This is a great one. So this is from Tiffany. She says, I have a student in my third grade class who gets really aggressive when things don't go their way. My instinct is to keep them in from recess or something like that so they'll learn to control themselves. But after listening to some of your podcasts, I'm not sure that's the right thing to do. I want to understand the root cause of the aggression. Help. What do you think?
Wow. This is really loaded. There's a lot going on. What I hear is like we're trying to stop the aggression by using, consequences, punishments, take it away. I love that she's asking, okay, what's the root cause? But without knowing the child, it's a little hard to know what the root cause is. So I think connection and just once the child's brain feels safe with you as the adult, I think slowly they'll start to, go through kind of like what we're talking about with attachment, go through these stages and be able to open up and communicate that. But there could be so many things. What would you say, Kaity? Because I'm thinking like sensory. I'm thinking there's just so many, like where they are in their attachment. Like I feel like there's so many things. Nervous system.
So 2 things I would say, like a question that is going to bring you more empathy in that moment is just like, why is this child not feeling safe? Instead of like, why is this child being mean or labeling them in any sort of negative way? Why is this child not feeling safe? And then understanding that aggression is the outcome of frustration, where we have a few other like little things going on. So I'll put this in the show notes. This is called Gordon Neufeld's The Traffic Circle. Have you seen this, Adriane?
No, I haven't.
It's like phenomenal. So he does this like 20-minute video. I'll put it in the show notes because I know we need to wrap up. But essentially, aggression is the result of a child interacting with something that's not going their way. So something they don't like happens, right? And the first thing they'll try to do, imagine like a little traffic circle with like 3 exit points, right? And aggression is the last exit point. The first one is to change, right? So you tell a kid, no, they can't do something. They're like, but I will be so good for you. And I will do this. And I promise, please, they'll try to change it. And once they can't change it, you have to kind of be the blocker there. Gordon Neufeld calls that being the angel of futility or something like that. I'll look that up. It is your role to say like, to stay connected, but no, right? We're not just going to change everything. We need to learn to adapt. Adapt is the next kind of way that you can get off this traffic circle. And that involves having a big feeling about it. There's going to be, when things don't go your way, it's sad. It's so sad. And if we are creating space for that sadness, and when we have a sadness, we say, oh yeah, it's so hard. It's so frustrating when you can't get your way. And I'm here for you. I'm not changing the answer. But yes, it's so frustrating. It's understandable that you're sad. Here, come cry. I'll hold you while you cry. Like, we're creating for space. We can deal with that through adaptation or sadness, essentially. But then if we don't create the space for sadness, then it's going to erupt into aggression. And that's the third exit point, where it's like, this thing's not working. I can't change it, and I can't feel sad about it. My sad has moved to mad, and I don't have a fully formed prefrontal cortex that says, I really want that toy, or I really want this thing, and I want to hit someone about it. I want to be aggressive. They don't have a mixed feeling to come in as a counterweight to that, to say, oh, but that would hurt them, right? They don't have the theory of mind or like the empathy to be like, oh, that would not go well, or I would get in trouble even, or like, I love my brother, or I love my friend. Why would I hit him? The inhibition, that moment, comes through feeling our feelings, because you can't feel 2 feelings if you've never been able to feel 1 feeling, right? So feel the big feeling, allow that. Right. That will grow into being able to experience mixed feelings, which leads to inhibition. And that is where we can, even though like I feel mad sometimes, like I get aggressive, like I'm like, oh, I'm going to lose my mind, right? But I have enough emotional regulation to be like, and that would not be okay. So I can stop myself, and then I can go back to be like, oh, I'm just going to go back to being sad about this, and I'm going to process this, and I'm going to go talk to someone about it or something like that. You can move yourself around the traffic circle when you have a fully formed prefrontal cortex. But if you don't, you need an adult that does have a fully formed prefrontal cortex to help you navigate that. And so in this moment, I would recognize that this is just frustration and immaturity put together. It's not meanness. It's not ruthlessness. It's not vindictiveness or anything like that, any label. It's just frustration plus immaturity. And so you're going to ask, what does this child feel frustrated about, right? And then we're going to help them through empathy move their mad back to sad.
Yeah. And you said hold space. Hold space is so powerful. And a lot of times it's just nonverbal. So, and if the aggression is usually the child is going to be in the limbic system, there's no thought, no rational thought thinking. So a lot of times just coming alongside non-verbally and minimizing your language, minimizing your words. And then whenever they can connect and the aggression is, subsided, then you can start, having these conversations to try to figure out what the root is. But I think that hold space is really, really powerful.
All right. Well, that's it for today. Thanks for listening to this episode of KindlED. We hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to subscribe to KindlED wherever you get your podcasts. Leave us a review, rate us, or share our episodes on social media, and tag us at PrendaLearn. For more KindlED content, head over to prenda.com/KindlED. Don't forget to email us your questions or challenges. You can submit those to podcast@prenda.com. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep kindling.